I stood in the middle of the glittering ballroom, the scent of expensive lilies and vintage champagne thick in the air. My mother-in-law, Beatrice, stood just 3 feet away, her voice carrying across the room like a sharpened blade. "It's such a shame," she sighed loudly to a group of her socialite friends, "that my son married for love instead of logic. Look at her, wearing a dress that probably cost less than my appetizers. Some people simply don't belong in rooms like this." My husband, Mark, didn't defend me. He just sipped his drink and looked away, ashamed of the woman he thought I was. They thought I was a charity case, a girl from the gutters who had swindled her way into their prestigious family. They thought I had nothing, but what they didn't know was that I owned the very building we were standing in. I wasn't the victim of their story. I was the architect of their downfall. For 3 years I had played the role of the penniless orphan, living in a cramped apartment and wearing thrift store clothes, all to see if Mark loved me or my bank account. Tonight the masquerade was ending, and the humiliation they planned for me was about to backfire in a way that would ruin them forever. My name is Elena, and my life used to be defined by numbers, billions of them. As the sole heiress to the Vanguard shipping empire, I grew up in a world where people only smiled at you because they wanted a piece of your inheritance. By the time I was 24, I was exhausted by the sycophants and the gold diggers. So I made a radical decision. I moved to a city where nobody knew my face, rented a studio apartment with a leaky faucet, and took a job as a junior graphic designer. I traded my designer handbags for canvas totes and my sports cars for a monthly bus pass. That was where I met Mark. He was an ambitious architect at the time, or so he said. He seemed different. He seemed to care about my thoughts, my dreams, and the way I liked my coffee. When he proposed a year later with a modest silver ring, I wept. Not because it was expensive, but because I thought I had finally found someone who loved Elena. The person, not Elena. The billionaire. However, once the wedding bells stopped ringing, the mask began to slip. Not mine, but theirs. Mark's family, the Blackwoods, were old money, or at least they acted like it. In reality, their family business was hemorrhaging cash, a fact they hid behind layers of credit and bravado. When Mark brought me home to meet his mother, Beatrice, she didn't see a daughter-in-law. She saw a stain on her carpet. She hated that I didn't have a dowry. She hated that my parents were supposedly deceased factory workers. She treated me like a servant, often handing me her coat or empty glass at family gatherings as if I were part of the catering staff. Mark, who had been so protective during our courtship, slowly succumbed to his mother's influence. He started making comments about my appearance, asking why I couldn't try harder to look like the wives of his business partners. He didn't know that my shabby clothes were a choice, a test that he was failing more miserably with every passing day. The tension reached a breaking point leading up to the Blackwood Foundation's annual gala. This was the biggest night of the year for them, a night meant to project power and wealth to the city's elite. For weeks, Beatrice had been dropping hints that I wasn't welcome. "It's a very exclusive guest list, Elena," she'd say while flipping through a luxury magazine. "Perhaps you'd be more comfortable staying home. I wouldn't want you to feel out of place among people of our stature." But I insisted on going. I wanted to see how far they would go. I wanted to see if Mark would finally stand up for his wife. On the night of the gala, I chose to wear a simple, elegant black dress. It had no labels, no flashy diamonds, and no lace. To the untrained eye, it looked like a bargain bin find. To a connoisseur, it was a bespoke piece of Italian silk. I did my own hair and makeup, keeping it minimal. When Mark saw me, his face fell. "Elena, is that really what you're wearing? Everyone who is anyone will be there. You look like, well, you look like you're going to a funeral." I smiled at him, a coldness beginning to settle in my chest. "Maybe I am, Mark. Maybe I am." When we arrived at the gala, the atmosphere was predatory. Beatrice was dressed in a gown that must have cost a fortune, dripping in emeralds that I knew for a fact were being used as collateral for a loan they hadn't paid back. She didn't even greet me. Instead, she whispered to the usher to keep an eye on the girl in the black dress, to make sure she didn't steal the silverware. I spent the first hour drifting through the crowd, listening to the whispers. I heard Mark's friends laughing about how he had settled for a girl from the slums. I heard Beatrice telling a prominent investor that I was a project she had taken on out of the kindness of her heart. The climax of their cruelty was planned for the dinner service. Beatrice had arranged for a charity auction where the wealthy guests would donate items or experiences. But she had added a special segment this year, the gift of transformation. She stood on the stage, the spotlight hitting her emeralds, and called my name. "I'd like to invite my daughter-in-law, Elena, to the stage," she said, her voice dripping with fake honey. Mark nudged me, whispering, "Just go up there. Don't make a scene." I walked up the stairs, my heart thumping not with fear, but with the thrill of the trap I was about to spring. Beatrice put an arm around my shoulder, looking out at the crowd of hundreds. "As you all know, the Blackwoods believe in uplifting those less fortunate. Elena comes from a very humble background. She hasn't had the advantages we've all enjoyed, so tonight, as part of our charity initiative, I'm opening a fund to give Elena a complete makeover, education, etiquette lessons, and a wardrobe that won't embarrass our family name. Who will start the bidding to help civilize this poor girl?" The room erupted in stifled giggles and hushed murmurs. I looked at Mark. He was looking at his shoes, a smirk playing on his lips. He wasn't embarrassed for me. He was enjoying the lesson his mother was teaching me. He thought this would finally break my spirit and make me subservient to their whims. They wanted to humiliate me in front of the most powerful people in the city. They wanted to show me that without them, I was nothing. They had no idea that I was the one who had signed the permit for this gala. They had no idea that the anonymous donor who had kept their family firm afloat for the last 6 months was a shell company owned by me. And they certainly didn't see the man in the dark suit standing at the back of the room, my personal attorney clutching a folder that would turn their world into ashes. The silence that followed Beatrice's announcement was deafening, broken only by the sound of a few muffled snickers from the front rows. I stood there, bathed in the harsh white spotlight, feeling the weight of hundreds of judgmental eyes. Beatrice's hand remained on my shoulder, her grip tight, a silent warning not to move or speak. She was enjoying this moment of absolute power. To her, I was a prop, a tool to demonstrate her supposed noblesse oblige. "Come now," she urged the crowd, her voice amplified by the microphone. "Surely someone wants to contribute to the Elena Fund. Think of it as a community service project. We are refining a diamond in the rough, emphasis on the rough." I looked out into the sea of faces. These were the titans of industry, the movers and shakers of the city, and many of them were people I had seen in my father's boardroom when I was just a teenager. I recognized Mr. Sterling in the third row, a man whose shipping contracts I had personally reviewed 6 months ago through my holding company. I saw Mrs. Gable, the queen of the local fashion scene, who was looking at my cheap dress with a squint of confusion. Unlike Beatrice, Mrs. Gable had an eye for quality. She knew silk when she saw it, but she was too intimidated by Beatrice's social standing to say anything. Mark finally looked up, catching my eye. Instead of the apology I expected, his expression was one of cold expectation. He nodded at me, as if telling me to play along, to be the grateful little pauper they wanted me to be. It was in that moment that the last flickering flame of affection I held for him died out completely. I realized that Mark didn't just fail to protect me. He was a co-conspirator in this psychological warfare. He didn't want a partner. He wanted a trophy he could mold, someone who would always be indebted to him. "I'll start the bidding at $500, a voice shouted from the back. It was one of Mark's fraternity brothers, a man named Chad who had spent the entire evening making gold digger jokes within earshot of me. The room laughed. Beatrice beamed. "Thank you, Chad. $500 toward Elena's first pair of real shoes. Do I hear 1,000? I took a deep breath, the coolness of the silk against my skin reminding me of who I actually was. I didn't pull away. I didn't cry. I simply reached out and gently took the microphone from Beatrice's hand. She resisted for a second, her eyes widening in surprise, but she couldn't struggle without making a scene. I stepped forward, the light hitting my face, and I smiled. It wasn't the shy, timid smile I had worn for 3 years. It was the smile of a CEO about to announce a hostile takeover. "Thank you, Beatrice," I said, my voice steady and resonant, lacking any of the nervous tremors they expected. "It's so incredibly generous of you to worry about my wardrobe. But I think there's been a slight misunderstanding. You see, I've been conducting a little experiment of my own over the last few years. I wanted to see what happened to a family's values when they believed they were superior to someone based solely on the balance of a bank account." Beatrice tried to grab the mic back, her face flushing a deep, angry red. "Elena, that's enough. You're making a fool of yourself. Get off the stage." "Oh, I'm just getting started," I continued, stepping away from her. "You talk about charity and uplifting the poor. Yet you haven't mentioned that the Blackwood Foundation is currently under investigation for mismanaging funds. Or perhaps you forgot to tell your guests that this very gala was paid for with a high-interest loan that is due, well, tomorrow morning." A gasp rippled through the room. The investors shifted uncomfortably. Mark stood up, his face pale. "Elena, stop this right now. You don't know what you're talking about. You're just a girl who grew up in a trailer park." I looked down at him from the stage. "Mark, I never told you I grew up in a trailer park. You just assumed I did because I worked a normal job and lived within my means. You assumed because I didn't flaunt wealth. I didn't have any. It's a common mistake for people who are obsessed with the image of money rather than the reality of it." I turned my gaze back to the audience. "I came here tonight expecting a celebration. Instead, I found a firing squad. It's fascinating, really. For 3 years I've cooked your meals, Beatrice. I've listened to you belittle my low-class upbringing. I've watched my husband distance himself from me whenever his wealthy friends were around, and all the while, I was the one keeping the lights on in your house." Beatrice let out a harsh, jagged laugh. "You? Keeping the lights on? Don't be ridiculous. My son works for one of the top firms in the state. We are the Blackwoods." "Your son works for a firm that is a subsidiary of Vanguard Holdings," I replied calmly. "And the Blackwood estate was foreclosed on 6 months ago. The only reason you're still living there is because a private entity bought the debt and allowed you to stay as caretakers until further notice. I am that entity, Beatrice. I am the president of Vanguard Holdings." The silence this time was different. It wasn't the silence of mockery. It was the silence of a vacuum. You could have heard a pin drop on the thick velvet carpet. Mr. Sterling stood up, his eyes wide. "Elena? Elena Vanguard? Julian Vanguard's daughter?" "Hello, Julian," I said, nodding to him. "It's been a while since the last board meeting. I apologize for the deception, but I needed to know who my real friends were." Mark was frozen. He looked like he had been struck by lightning. "Elena, you're a Vanguard? Why didn't you tell me? Why would you lie to me?" "I didn't lie, Mark. I just didn't lead with my wallet. I told you I wanted a simple life. I told you I valued honesty and loyalty. You were the one who lied. You lied about your family's finances. You lied about your feelings for me. And you lied to yourself about what kind of man you are. You didn't marry me because you love me. You married me because you thought I was someone you could control. Someone who would be so grateful for the Blackwood name that I would never question you." Beatrice was shaking, her hand clutching her emerald necklace so hard I thought the string might snap. "This is a lie. This is some kind of sick joke. You're just a graphic designer. I saw your paycheck." "I am a graphic designer," I said. "I love design. It's my passion." But I also own the company that employs me, and tomorrow morning I'll be making some very important decisions regarding the Blackwood debt. But before we get to that, I believe there was a bidding war happening. I looked at Chad, who looked like he wanted to melt into the floor. Chad, was it? $500 for my shoes? Tell you what, I'll match that $500 with $5 million donated to the city's actual homeless shelters, not this vanity project of a foundation. I turned to my attorney, Simon, who was now walking toward the stage. He handed me a leather-bound folder. The room was buzzing now, a low roar of gossip and shock. The power dynamic had shifted so violently that the air felt electric. Beatrice looked small. Mark looked broken. And I felt like I was finally breathing for the first time in 3 years. Now, I said, my voice dropping to a cold, professional whisper that still carried through the speakers. Let's talk about the real reason we're all here. Because this isn't just about a dress, it's about an eviction. The atmosphere in the ballroom had shifted from a predatory circus to a courtroom. Beatrice was gasping for air, her face alternating between a ghostly pale and a frantic, blotchy red. She tried to step toward me, perhaps to snatch the folder, perhaps to plead, but Simon, my attorney, stepped firmly between us. Simon was a man of tall stature and granite-like composure, the kind of person you only hire when you intend to win a war. He didn't say a word. He simply stood there, a physical barrier between the world of lies and the world of consequences. I opened the folder. The crisp white pages inside contained the death certificates of the Blackwood family's social standing. For the past 6 months, I began, my voice amplified by the professional sound system, the Blackwood estate has been operating on a grace period. Mark, you told me your family's firm was restructuring. In reality, you were selling off assets to cover interest payments on loans you took out to maintain this facade. You bought a new luxury SUV last month, Mark. Do you remember telling me it was a company perk? It wasn't. It was bought with money meant for the staff's pension fund. A collective gasp went up from the waitstaff, standing at the edges of the room. I saw several of them exchange looks of fury. Mark took a step toward the stage, his hands shaking. Elena, you can't do this here. This is private. We're a family. We were never a family, Mark, I countered, looking him dead in the eye. A family doesn't stand by and laugh while their own are publicly humiliated. A family doesn't use their spouse as a punchline for a charity joke. You didn't treat me like a wife. You treated me like a secret you were ashamed of. And Beatrice, I turned to my mother-in-law, who was now leaning against a grand piano for support. You treated me like a toy you could break for your own amusement. I pulled out a specific document, a bright red notice of default. This building we are standing in, the Grand Sapphire, is owned by a subsidiary of Vanguard. You booked this hall on credit, Beatrice. Credit that was extended based on the prestige of your name. But as of 4 o'clock this afternoon, when I signed the final papers, the Blackwood name is worth exactly 0 in this city. I looked at the crowd. These people, who had been laughing moments ago, were now looking at Beatrice and Mark with a mixture of horror and disgust. In high society, poverty is a tragedy, but being a fraud is a death sentence. The Blackwoods hadn't just lost their money, they had lost their mask. I spent 3 years living in that tiny apartment with you, Mark, I said, my voice softening but remaining cold. I watched you spend thousands on watches while I pinched pennies to buy groceries. I wanted to see if there was a soul beneath the designer suits. I waited for the day you would say, Elena, let's just be us. We don't need my mother's approval or this fake lifestyle. But that day never came. Instead, you became more like her every single day. You started looking at me the way she does, like I was something dirty on the bottom of your shoe. Beatrice finally found her voice, though it was shrill and cracked. You're a monster! To lure us into this trap, to pretend to be poor just to mock us. You're the one who is cruel, Elena. You had all this power and you let us struggle. I laughed, and it was a sound of pure, liberated amusement. Struggle. Beatrice, you live in a 20-bedroom mansion. You have a chauffeur. Your struggle was wondering if people would find out you're broke. My experiment wasn't to mock you. It was to see if you were worth saving. If you had shown me a single shred of genuine kindness, if you had treated me with the basic dignity you'd offer a stranger, I would have cleared your debts. I would have saved your family name. I had the checks written and ready in my desk drawer for 3 years. The realization hit Mark like a physical blow. He staggered back, his eyes darting to the folder in my hand. He realized that for 3 years, he had been married to the literal solution to all his problems. And he had spent that time kicking her. He had traded a billion-dollar future for the petty pleasure of feeling superior to a poor girl. But tonight, I continued, you showed me exactly who you are. You didn't just invite me to a party. You invited me to a public execution of my dignity. You wanted to civilize me. You wanted to put me in a fund. Well, the fund is closed, and so is your credit line. I turned to Simon. Simon, please serve the papers. Simon stepped off the stage and walked directly to Mark. With a practiced clinical motion, he handed him a thick envelope. Mark Blackwood, you are hereby served with papers for legal separation and a freeze on all joint accounts. Though, as we both know, those accounts are currently overdrawn. Furthermore, you are being served with a notice of eviction from the Blackwood estate, effective in 48 hours. The room was so quiet you could hear the hum of the air conditioning. Mark looked down at the envelope as if it were a poisonous snake. Beatrice let out a faint moan and slumped further against the piano. The socialites who had been surrounding her moments ago had already begun to drift away, creating a literal circle of isolation around her. No one wanted to be caught standing too close to a sinking ship. And one more thing, I said, leaning into the microphone for the final blow. The Elena Fund that Beatrice started tonight. I think it's a wonderful idea. But we're going to rename it. It will now be the Blackwood Restorative Justice Fund. It will be funded by the liquidation of the Blackwood jewelry collection and their fleet of vehicles. The proceeds will go toward providing housing for the families who were displaced when Mark's firm cut corners on the East Side development project last year. A few people in the crowd actually started to clap. It began with the waitstaff, then a few of the younger investors, and finally, a roar of applause filled the room. It wasn't for the money, it was for the justice. I walked to the edge of the stage and looked down at Mark. He looked up at me, tears streaming down his face. Elena, please, we can talk about this. I love you. I was under a lot of pressure from my mother. You know how she is. I do know how she is, Mark, I said, my voice barely a whisper yet perfectly audible. But I finally know how you are too, and that's the most valuable lesson I've ever paid for. I handed the microphone to a stunned gala coordinator and walked off the stage. My head was held high, my simple black dress flowing behind me like a queen's robe. As I passed Beatrice, she reached out a trembling hand to catch my sleeve. I didn't even look at her. I simply moved out of her reach and kept walking toward the exit. I didn't need a chauffeur. I didn't need a crown. For the first time in my life, I was Elena Vanguard, and I was finally free of the shadows. But as I reached the heavy oak doors of the ballroom, I paused. I felt a vibration in my clutch purse. It was my phone. A text from an unknown number. It read, "You think the game is over just because you revealed your name. You've only just made yourself a bigger target. Look toward the balcony." My blood ran cold. I slowly turned around, scanning the high marble balconies that overlooked the ballroom. The threat hung in the air, invisible to the cheering crowd, but heavy as lead in my chest. I looked up at the darkened balcony, the ornate gold railings casting long, twisted shadows across the marble pillars. For a split second, I saw a silhouette, a tall, thin figure leaning against the darkness. Then, with a flicker of movement, they were gone. My heart hammered against my ribs. I had spent 3 years hiding in plain sight, thinking I was the one pulling the strings. But that text message suggested someone else had been watching the puppeteer. I didn't let my composure slip. I was a vanguard. We were taught to bleed internally so the sharks wouldn't scent the weakness. I stepped through the heavy oak doors and into the cool night air, Simon following closely behind. The paparazzi were already swarming the entrance, tipped off by the scandal erupting inside. Flashbulbs exploded like tiny supernovas, blinding me for a moment. Ms. Vanguard, is it true you've been living as a pauper? Elena, what happens to the Blackwood firm now? Is it true you're evicting your mother-in-law tonight? Simon placed a firm hand on my shoulder, guiding me toward a waiting black sedan. Not the bus I usually took, but a reinforced vehicle from my family's private fleet. No comments tonight, Simon barked at the press. A formal statement will be released by Vanguard Holdings at 9 a.m. tomorrow. As the car door slammed shut, the muffled roar of the crowd faded. I sank into the leather seat, the adrenaline finally beginning to ebb, leaving a hollow ache in its wake. I looked at the phone in my hand. The message was still there, a digital ghost. Simon, I said, my voice sounding distant even to myself. Trace this number, now. Simon took the phone, his brow furrowing as he scrolled. It's a burner, Elena. Routed through 3 different offshore servers. It'll take time. But more importantly, are you okay? That was quite a performance. It wasn't a performance, I whispered, looking out the window as the city lights blurred past. It was an autopsy. I had to see if anything was left of the man I married. There wasn't. Just a hollow shell filled with his mother's vanity. And the threat? Simon asked, his professional mask slipping for a moment to reveal genuine concern. He had worked for my father for 20 years. He was the closest thing I had to a confidant. Someone knew I was going to reveal myself tonight. Or worse, they were waiting for me to do it. By reclaiming my name, I've reclaimed my assets, but I've also stepped back onto the chessboard. My father had enemies, Simon. Men who didn't care about shipping routes, only about the power those routes represented. We reached my Humber home, the small, cramped apartment on the edge of the industrial district. It felt strange to be here now, knowing I would never sleep in this bed again. I had kept this place as a sanctuary, a reminder of a simpler life, but now it felt like a trap. I went inside to gather the few things that actually mattered to me. A photo of my father, my sketchbooks, and the silver ring Mark had given me. I looked at the ring for a long time. It was cheap, the silver already tarnishing. I realized now he hadn't bought it because he was struggling. He bought it because he didn't think I was worth the investment of a real diamond. I threw the ring into the trash can by the door. Suddenly, a loud thud echoed from the hallway. I froze. The building was old, the floors creaky, but this was the sound of a heavy weight hitting wood. I crept toward the door, my hand hovering over the lock. Through the peephole, I saw a man. He was dressed in a courier's uniform, but his posture was all wrong. Too rigid, too alert. He left a flat, square package leaning against my door and walked away without knocking. I waited 5 minutes before opening the door. The hallway was empty, the air smelling of stale cigarettes and cheap floor wax. I brought the package inside and sliced it open with a kitchen knife. Inside was a vintage oil painting. It was a portrait of my mother, who had passed away when I was 10. She was wearing the very same emerald necklace Beatrice had been flaunting at the gala, the original one, the one that had been stolen from our family estate nearly a decade ago. On the back of the canvas, written in elegant, terrifyingly familiar calligraphy, were the words, "The Blackwoods weren't the only ones stealing from you, Elena. Some thieves are much closer to home. Happy homecoming." My breath hitched. My mother's jewelry had disappeared in a burglary that the police had never solved. My father had been devastated, claiming the loss of the heirlooms was what finally broke his heart. If the Blackwoods didn't have the real necklace, if Beatrice's was a high-quality fake or a replica, then who had the original, and why send it to me now? The phone rang in my hand. It was Mark. I didn't want to answer, but something told me this wasn't just a plea for forgiveness. "What do you want, Mark?" I snapped. His voice was frantic, sobbing. "Elena, you have to help us. Some men. They came to the house right after we got back from the gala. They said our protection was gone, because the debt had changed hands. They're taking everything, Elena. They even took the furniture. They said if I didn't tell them where the Vanguard archive was, they'd hurt my mother." "The Vanguard archive." I felt a chill. "Mark, I don't know what you're talking about. There is no archive." "They don't believe me," Mark screamed. "They think you hid it in our house. They're tearing the walls apart, Elena. Please. I know I was a jerk. I know I messed up. But please don't let them kill us." I hung up. My mind was racing. The Vanguard archive was a myth, a legend among corporate spies about a list of every bribe, every secret deal, and every political favor my father had ever recorded. I had always believed it was just a ghost story, used to keep competitors in line. But if someone was willing to assault the Blackwoods to find it, they believed it was real. I realized then that my pretending to be poor wasn't just a test of love. It had been a period of safety. For 3 years, the world thought Elena Vanguard had vanished or died. By coming out of the shadows to humiliate the Blackwoods, I hadn't just taken my revenge. I had rung a dinner bell for every predator my father had ever outmaneuvered. I turned to Simon, who was standing by the window, watching the street. "Change of plans. We aren't going to the hotel. We're going to the Blackwood estate." "Elena, that's dangerous," Simon cautioned. "If there are mercenaries there. If they're there for the archive, they won't find it," I said, my voice hardening. "Because I think I know where it actually is. And if I don't get it first, this city is going to burn." As we headed back to the car, I looked up at the apartment building one last time. In the window of the unit across the street, a camera lens glinted in the moonlight. I wasn't just being watched, I was being broadcast. The drive to the Blackwood estate was a blur of neon lights and cold realization. I sat in the back of the armored sedan, my fingers tracing the ornate frame of my mother's recovered portrait. The Vanguard archive. The words felt like a curse. If my father truly had kept a record of the elite's dirty laundry, it wasn't a fortune. It was a suitcase full of dynamite. And by revealing my identity at the gala, I had essentially told the world I held the detonator. "Simon," I said, not taking my eyes off the darkened streets. "Who knew about the burglary 10 years ago? Truly knew the details." Simon gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. "Only the inner circle, Elena. Your father, myself, the insurance investigators, and your father's primary business partner at the time, Victor Thorne. But Thorne disappeared shortly after your father's funeral. Most assumed he fled the country to escape the same debts that were circling the company back then. Victor Thorne. The name tasted like ash. He had been like an uncle to me. The man who taught me how to play chess and how to read a balance sheet. If he was back, this wasn't just about money. It was about a decade-old grudge. As we turned onto the long, winding driveway of the Blackwood estate, the sight that met us was chaotic. 3 black SUVs were parked haphazardly across the manicured lawn, their tires churning up the expensive sod Beatrice had spent thousands on. The front doors of the mansion were wide open, spilling light onto the gravel. I could hear the distant sound of glass shattering and Beatrice's shrill, hysterical screaming. "Stay in the car, Simon," I commanded, reaching into the glove box for the small, sleek self-defense tool my father had insisted I carry. "Elena, absolutely not," Simon protested. "We should call the police. The police are 10 minutes away, and the people inside won't wait for a siren. If they think the archive is here, they'll kill Mark and Beatrice, just to prove a point. I won't have their blood on my hands, even if I despise them." I stepped out of the car, the cold night air biting at my skin. I didn't run. I walked with the measured pace of someone who owned the ground she stepped on. As I entered the foyer, the scene was worse than Mark had described. The velvet curtains had been ripped down, the antique vases smashed, and the grand piano, the one Beatrice had leaned against so smugly hours ago, had been hacked into pieces as if they were looking for something hidden in its belly. Two men in tactical gear were holding Mark by the collar of his expensive tuxedo. His face was bruised, his nose bleeding. Beatrice was collapsed in a corner, her emerald necklace gone, her hair a wild nest of gray and gold. "Let them go," I said, my voice echoing through the hollowed-out room. The men turned. They weren't common thugs. They were professionals, their eyes cold and vacant. From the shadows of the grand staircase, a third man emerged. He wasn't in tactical gear. He wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit and carried a cane topped with a silver wolf's head. "Elena," he said, a thin, cruel smile stretching across his face. "You always did have impeccable timing, just like your father." "Victor," I breathed. He looked older, his hair completely white, but the predatory gleam in his eyes hadn't faded. "I should have known you were the one behind the curtain. Sending the painting was a nice touch. A bit dramatic, don't you think?" Victor chuckled, leaning on his cane. "I wanted to remind you of what was lost, and what can be regained. Your father was a fool, Elena. He thought he could use the archive to balance the world. He kept secrets to protect people. I want to use them to own them." Mark looked at me, his eyes wide with a mix of terror and a pathetic sliver of hope. "Elena, tell him. Tell him we don't have it. I didn't even know it existed." "He's telling the truth, Victor," I said, stepping further into the room, drawing the attention away from Mark. "The Blackwoods are too shallow to be trusted with a secret that important. My father knew they were parasites. He would never have hidden the archive here." Victor's smile faded. "Then where is it? I've spent 10 years tracing your father's steps. I watched you disappear into that pathetic little life of yours, thinking you'd eventually lead me to it. I thought maybe it was in that hovel you call an apartment, or buried in the debt of this family. But I'm losing patience." "You watched me for 3 years?" I asked, a sense of disgust washing over me. "You let me live in poverty, let me be mistreated by these people, just to see if I'd dig up a ghost?" "It was a very entertaining show," Victor remarked. "The poor little rich girl playing house. But the play is over. Tell me where the archive is, or I'll have my men start with the boy's fingers. He's an architect, isn't he? It would be a shame if he could never draw again." Mark let out a whimpering sob. I looked at him, the man I had once thought I loved. Even now, in this moment of absolute terror, I felt a flicker of pity. He was a coward and a narcissist, but he didn't deserve this. "The archive isn't a physical book, Victor," I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "My father was smarter than that. He knew that anything written down could be stolen, and anything digital could be hacked." Victor narrowed his eyes. "Go on." "He encoded the archive into something you've already seen. Something you've probably touched a dozen times tonight." I glanced at the debris around the room. "But you were too busy tearing things apart to actually look at them." Victor signaled to his men to hold their position. He walked toward me, the tap-tap-tap of his cane sounding like a ticking clock. "Don't play games with me, Elena. I am not your husband. I will not be swayed by a pretty face or a clever speech." "I'm not playing," I said, pointing to the portrait of my mother that Simon was now carrying into the house behind me. "The painting you sent me. You thought the secret was behind the canvas, or perhaps in the frame. You looked for a hidden compartment, but you didn't look at the paint itself." Victor froze. "The paint? My mother was an artist," I said, a lie forming effortlessly in my mind. "She developed a specific type of synthetic pigment that only reacts to a certain UV frequency. The archive isn't in the painting. The painting is the archive. The brushstrokes are a sophisticated steganographic map. Without the frequency key, it's just a picture of a dead woman. It was a complete fabrication, a desperate gamble to get them out of the house and away from the Black Woods. But Victor was a man obsessed with genius solutions. He wanted to believe my father had done something brilliant. "Give me the painting," Victor commanded. "No," I said. "You let the Black Woods go. You let them leave this property and you give me your word. Not that it's worth much. That you won't touch them again. Once they're gone, I'll give you the key." Victor looked at Mark and Beatrice with pure contempt. "They're useless to me anyway. Fine, get them out of here." The men tossed Mark to the floor. He scrambled toward his mother, helping her up. They didn't look at me. They didn't thank me. They just ran toward the back exit, fleeing the wreckage of their lives. I watched them go, knowing that even if they survived tonight, they were already dead to the world I inhabited. Now I was alone in the room with a madman and his mercenaries. "The key, Elena," Victor said, his hand outstretched. "The key isn't a code, Victor," I said, stepping back toward the door where Simon was waiting. "The key is a person. My father always said the most secure vault in the world is a human memory." I signaled to Simon. Before Victor could react, the lights in the mansion went out. A high-pitched screeching sound, a sonic deterrent Simon had installed in the sedan, erupted from outside, disorienting the men in the room. "Go!" I yelled to Simon. But as we turned to flee, a hand grabbed my arm with the strength of an iron vice. It wasn't Victor, it was one of the mercenaries. And in the chaos I realized I had made a fatal mistake. Victor wasn't the only one who wanted the archive. A voice whispered in my ear, cold as the grave. "You shouldn't have lied about the paint, Elena, because I'm the one who actually helped your mother hide it." The grip on my arm was agonizing, a physical manifestation of a past I thought was buried. The high-pitched screech of the sonic deterrent continued to wail outside, but inside the pitch-black foyer, the air felt frozen. I couldn't see the man who held me, but the scent was unmistakable. A mix of expensive tobacco and the ozone smell of a laboratory. It was a scent from my childhood. "Dr. Eris?" I gasped, my voice barely audible over the noise. The grip loosened just enough for me to breathe, but not to escape. "You were always the observant one, Elena," the voice replied. Dr. Eris had been my father's lead research scientist, the man responsible for the Vanguard Group's most classified technological breakthroughs. Everyone thought he had died in the same accident that claimed my father's life. Suddenly, the backup generators kicked in, flickering the emergency lights to life in a dim, sickly red hue. I turned to see him. Eris looked like a ghost, gaunt, scarred across one side of his face, but his eyes were burning with a terrifying intelligence. Victor Thorne stood a few feet away, looking just as shocked as I was. "Aris," Victor hissed, his cane trembling. "You were dead. I saw the wreckage myself." "You saw what I wanted you to see, Victor," Aris said, dismissing the billionaire as if he were a nagging child. He turned back to me, his eyes scanning my face with a clinical intensity. "The archive isn't in the paint, Elena. You were bold to lie, but you've forgotten that I was the one who developed the liquid-state data storage for your father. The archive isn't a map, it's a biological sequence." My stomach turned. My father had always been obsessed with the idea of living legacy, but I had never imagined he would take it literally. "What are you saying?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Your father knew that assets could be seized and paintings could be burned," Aris explained, his voice dropping into a hypnotic rhythm. "So he placed the archive where no one could find it without the proper key. He encoded the data into the non-coding DNA of the only thing he truly valued. You, Elena, you are the archive." The room seemed to tilt. I looked at my hands, my skin, suddenly feeling like a stranger in my own body. I wasn't just an heiress. I was a hard drive. I was a collection of every secret, every scandal, and every drop of blood my father had ever spilled or saved. This was why I had been watched. This was why my simple life had been allowed to continue. They were waiting for me to reach maturity, for the data to stabilize, or for the moment I stepped back into the light. Victor Thorne let out a jagged, hungry laugh. Even better. I don't need a painting. I just need a laboratory and a surgeon. You'll have neither. Simon's voice rang out. I looked toward the door. Simon wasn't alone. Behind him, a dozen men in tactical gear, not Victor's men but the private security force of Vanguard Holdings, moved in with practiced precision. They had silent weapons drawn, laser sights dancing across Victor and Aris's chests. The police are 5 minutes away, Victor, Simon said, his voice as cold as a winter morning. And my team is 30 seconds away from ending this. Drop the girl. Aris didn't flinch. He looked at the laser dots on his chest as if they were curious insects. You think you can protect her, Simon? You're just a lawyer. You don't understand the magnitude of what she carries. If this data is released, governments will fall. The global economy will reset. Do you really want that responsibility on your hands? I don't care about the world, Simon replied, his finger tightening on the trigger of his sidearm. I care about Elena. Step away from her. In the chaos of the standoff, I saw my opening. I didn't move toward Simon. I moved toward the grand fireplace, where a heavy iron poker lay among the debris. I grabbed it, the cold metal grounding me. Nobody is taking me anywhere, I said, my voice rising with a newfound authority. And nobody is extracting anything. If I am the archive, then I am the one who decides what happens to it. I looked at Victor, who looked pathetic in the red light, stripped of his bravado. Then I looked at Aris, the man who had turned me into a science project. You think you own me because of what's in my blood? I challenged Aris. My father might have put the data there, but he gave me the mind to use it. And I know exactly how to trigger the self-destruct sequence in the Vanguard servers that are synced to my vitals. If I die, or if I'm taken against my will, the archive doesn't just disappear. It broadcasts to every news agency, every whistleblower, and every court in the world. Is that what you want, Victor? To have your own crimes whispered in every ear on the planet? Victor paled. He knew he wasn't a hero in my father's records. He was a thief and a traitor. You're bluffing, Aris said, though his eyes showed a flicker of doubt. Try me, I said, pressing the tip of the iron poker against the heavy stone of the mantel. I've spent 3 years living with nothing. I'm not afraid of losing everything again. Can you say the same? The stalemate was broken by the distant sound of sirens. Not just one or two, but a fleet of them, converging on the estate. The anonymous tip I had instructed my assistant to send before the gala had finally borne fruit. This isn't over, Elena, Aris whispered, his grip finally releasing. He stepped back into the shadows of the dining hall, his movements unnervingly fluid. The data wants to be free. You can't hold back the tide forever. Watch me, I replied. Victor tried to bolt toward the side entrance, but Simon's team was faster. They tackled him to the ground, his silver-headed cane skidding across the floor. Aris, however, seemed to vanish. By the time the first police officers burst through the doors, the scientist was gone, leaving behind only the scent of tobacco and a sense of impending doom. I dropped the iron poker, my legs finally giving way. Simon was at my side in an instant, wrapping his coat around my shoulders. Are they gone? I asked, my voice cracking. Victor is in custody. The mercenaries are being disarmed, but Aris, we lost him in the gardens, Simon said grimly. I looked around the ruins of the Blackwood mansion. This place, which had once been a symbol of my husband's supposed status, was now just a hollowed-out shell. And in the middle of it all stood Beatrice and Mark, who had been caught by the police trying to sneak out the back with a suitcase full of silverware. They were brought back into the foyer, handcuffed and shivering. Beatrice looked at me, her eyes filled with a desperate, ugly hope. Elena, tell them we're family. Tell them it was all a big misunderstanding. I walked over to them, my face devoid of emotion. I looked at Mark. He couldn't even meet my eyes. He looked like a broken toy. "I told you, Beatrice," I said quietly. "The Elena Fund is closed. You wanted to humiliate me to make yourselves feel big. Now you'll have plenty of time to feel small in a prison cell for the financial fraud and the money laundering Simon has documented." "Elena, please," Mark whispered. "I love you. I can change." "You had 3 years to change, Mark," I said. "You had 1,000 chances to be a good man. You chose to be a Blackwood instead. Now you have to live with that." As the police led them away, Mark turned back one last time. "What will you do now? You have all that money, all those secrets. You're just as trapped as we are." I watched them being pushed into the back of a squad car. His words echoed in the empty hall. He was right about one thing. The secrets in my blood were a heavy burden, but he was wrong about the rest. "I'm going to do what my father should have done," I whispered to the empty room. "I'm going to use the truth to set myself free." But as I turned to leave with Simon, I noticed something on the floor where Aris had been standing. A small, black device, no larger than a coin. It was blinking a steady, rhythmic blue. I stared at the small, blinking device on the floor. The blue light felt like a heartbeat. Mechanical, mulled, and rhythmic. I didn't reach for it. My father had taught me that in the world of high-stakes corporate espionage, the most dangerous things often come in the smallest packages. Simon noticed it too, his hand moving instinctively to keep me back. "Don't touch it," he warned, signaling one of his security technicians to bring over a containment bag. "Aris doesn't leave souvenirs unless they're meant to deliver a message." The technician carefully swept the device into a lead-lined pouch, but the blue light was so intense it seemed to glow right through the fabric for a few seconds before fading. My mind was spinning. Aris had said the archive was biological, that it was inside me. If that were true, why leave a physical device? Unless the device wasn't a storage unit, but a transmitter. "Simon," I said, my voice tight, "if Aris was telling the truth about my DNA, then that device, it might have been scanning me, or syncing." Simon's expression darkened. "We need to get you to a secure facility, not a hospital, one of our own medical labs. We need to know exactly what he did to you, Elena, and we need to do it before anyone else realizes what you've become." As we walked out of the Blackwood estate, the scene was a grim tableau of fallen grace. Beatrice was being loaded into a separate transport, screaming about her rights and her lineage while a female officer tried to keep her calm. Mark was silent, his head bowed, looking like a ghost of the man I had married. I felt a strange sense of closure as I watched the blue and red lights reflect off the shattered windows of the mansion. The Blackwoods were gone. The poor girl they had tried to crush had outlived their legacy in a single night. But the relief was short-lived. We boarded the armored sedan and sped away from the chaos, heading toward a private research wing owned by Vanguard in the heart of the city. During the ride, I stared at my reflection in the dark glass of the window. I looked the same pale skin, the same dark eyes, but I felt like a stranger to myself. I was a vessel for secrets that could topple empires. Every breath I took felt heavier, as if the data itself had physical weight. "I need to know everything, Simon," I said, turning away from the window. "No more secrets, no more protecting me. If my father did this to me, I deserve to know why." Simon sighed, leaning back into the leather seat. "Your father was a man of great vision, Elena, but he was also a man of great fear. He saw the way the world was moving, the greed, the corruption, the way information was becoming the only true currency. He didn't trust digital servers. He didn't trust paper. He believed that the only thing a person would truly fight to protect was their own child. He thought that by putting the archive in you, he was ensuring it would only be used by someone with a conscience. He thought he was giving you the ultimate insurance policy. He didn't give me insurance," I snapped. "He gave me a target on my back. He turned his daughter into a flash drive." "He loved you, Elena," Simon said softly. "In his own twisted, brilliant way, he thought this would make you invincible. He never intended for Aris to find out. Aris was supposed to be the architect, not the owner. We arrived at the Vanguard Research Center, a sleek, windowless monolith of steel and glass. I was hurried through a private entrance and into a high-tech medical suite. For the next 4 hours, I was subjected to a battery of tests that made the Blackwoods Humiliation feel like a walk in the park. Blood draws, retinal scans, and a deep-tissue MRI that seemed to map every fiber of my being. I sat on the edge of the examination table, wrapped in a cold paper gown, waiting for the results. Simon entered the room, holding a tablet. His face was unreadable. "Is it there?" I asked. "It's more complex than we thought," Simon began, sitting across from me. "It's not just data written in your junk DNA. It's a dormant CRISPR sequence. It's a living encryption. It's spread across your entire genome, but it's inactive. It requires a specific biochemical trigger to become readable. Without that trigger, you're just a normal one with a very expensive set of genes." "And the device Aris left?" "It was a proximity sensor," Simon explained. "It confirmed the presence of the sequence. It didn't steal the data, but it told Aris exactly where the vault is. He doesn't need to kidnap you to get the information, Elena. He just needs to get close enough with a high-frequency scanner once the sequence is triggered." "How is it triggered?" Simon hesitated. "According to your father's old notes, it's triggered by a specific surge in adrenaline and oxytocin, a stress-love response. It was designed to activate only when you felt you were in extreme danger or when you were protecting someone you loved. He wanted the archive to be available to you only when you truly needed it to survive." I let out a bitter laugh. "So, 3 years of being bullied by Beatrice didn't do it. Marrying a man who hated me didn't trigger it." "Apparently not," Simon said. "Because deep down, you knew you were in control. You were never in true danger, because you knew you could leave at any time. But tonight when Aris grabbed you, when you realized what you were, your levels spiked. The sequence is beginning to wake up, Elena. The vault is opening." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. My father's fail-safe was working, but it was working against me. If the data became readable, I would become the most hunted person on the planet. "We have to stop it," I said. "Can we delete it? Can we overwrite it?" "We don't have the key," Simon admitted. "Only your father had the off switch. Or perhaps Aris." Suddenly the lights in the lab flickered. A low hum began to vibrate through the floor. On the monitors, the data streams from my tests began to scramble, replaced by a single, repeating image. The wolf's head from Victor Thorne's cane. "He's here," I whispered. "That's impossible," Simon said, standing up and reaching for his radio. "This facility is a fortress." A voice crackled over the intercom system, but it wasn't a security guard. It was the smooth, synthetic-edged voice of Dr. Aris. "Elena, you always did underestimate the power of a living system," Aris said, his voice echoing from every speaker in the room. "You think you're in a fortress? I designed the security protocols for this building 5 years before your father died. I didn't break in. I simply came home." The glass doors of the medical suite hissed open. But it wasn't Aris who stepped through. It was a group of men in Vanguard security uniforms, men I recognized from our own payroll. They weren't looking at Simon for orders. They were looking at me. "The board of directors has called an emergency session, Ms. Vanguard," the lead guard said, his voice void of emotion. "They feel that your condition makes you unfit to lead the company. Under the stability clause your father wrote, they are taking temporary custody of all Vanguard assets, including you." I looked at Simon. He looked horrified. "I didn't know. I didn't see this coming." "Of course you didn't," Aris's voice continued over the speakers. "Because the board isn't working for Victor Thorne. They aren't even working for me. They're working for the archive. They want the power, Elena. And they've realized that as long as you're free, they're just employees. But if you're contained, they're gods." I stood up, pulling the paper gown around me like a suit of armor. I had spent 3 years pretending to be powerless. I had spent one night proving I was anything but. I wasn't going back into a cage. not a social one and not a scientific one. "Simon," I said, my voice steady, "the stress-love trigger. You said it happens when I'm protecting someone I love." "Yes," Simon said, confused. I looked at him. The man who had been my father's friend. The man who had protected me when I had nothing. He was the only family I had left. "Then I suggest you get behind me," I said, "because I'm about to give the board exactly what they asked for. I'm going to show them the truth." I didn't feel fear. I felt a surge of white-hot clarity. As the guards moved toward me, a strange sensation washed over my skin. A tingling, electric heat. On the monitors behind me, the scrambled data began to align into perfect crystalline structures. The archive wasn't just waking up. It was responding to my will. The tingling sensation under my skin intensified, shifting from a dull hum to a sharp, rhythmic pulse. It felt as though 1,000 tiny needles were knitting themselves into a pattern beneath my flesh. On the monitors surrounding the lab, the wolf's head icon flickered and died, replaced by a torrent of cascading gold numbers and encrypted files. The guards froze. The air in the room felt ionized, smelling of ozone and ancient paper. "What are you doing?" the lead guard demanded, his hand hovering over his holster. He looked at the screens, then back at me, his eyes wide with a primitive kind of fear. "I'm not doing anything," I replied, my voice sounding deeper, more resonant in the small room. "The archive is doing it. You wanted the Vanguard secrets? Here they are. But be careful what you wish for. You can't handle the weight of the truth." Suddenly, the monitors didn't just show data. They began to play videos. These weren't security feeds. They were high-definition recordings of private conversations, secret handshakes, and signed ledgers of corruption. One screen showed the chairman of the board, a man named Henderson, accepting a bribe from a foreign shipping conglomerate. Another showed the head of security, the very man standing in front of me, transferring funds into an offshore account that belonged to Victor Thorne's shell company. The guards looked at each other, the color draining from their faces. Their own crimes were being broadcast in real time on the very screens they were supposed to be monitoring. "Shut it down!" Henderson's voice screamed over the intercom. He sounded frantic, the cool arrogance of the boardroom replaced by the shrill panic of a cornered rat. "Aris, shut it down now!" "I can't." Aris's voice crackled back, sounding both frustrated and fascinated. "She's not just accessing the data, Henderson. She's integrated with the network. Her biological rhythm has synchronized with the building's mainframe. She's become the administrator." I stepped forward, the paper gown fluttering behind me. I felt a strange sense of detachment, as if I were watching the scene from a great height. I wasn't just Elena anymore. I was the sum of every secret my father had ever kept. I could feel the electricity in the walls, the data flowing through the fiber optic cables, the heartbeat of the building itself. "The board is dismissed," I said, my voice projecting through the intercom system, overriding Henderson. "Your contracts are void, your assets are frozen, and the evidence of your treason has already been sent to the Department of Justice, the SEC, and the global press." "You can't do that," the lead guard yelled, finally drawing his weapon. "You're just a girl." He never got the chance to aim. The medical bay's automated defense system, a set of high-intensity strobe lights and ultrasonic emitters designed to incapacitate intruders, triggered instantly. The guards collapsed to their knees, clutching their ears as the sound tore through their equilibrium. Simon, who I had signaled to cover his ears, watched in awe from behind the examination table. I walked past the incapacitated men, my bare feet silent on the cold linoleum. I reached the terminal and placed my hand on the glass. The data flowed into me, a cold rush of information that told me everything. I saw where Aris was hiding, in the sub-basement, in a laboratory that didn't appear on any official blueprints. I saw the back doors he had built into the city's infrastructure. And I saw the final piece of my father's plan. The archive wasn't just a record of the past, It was a weapon for the future. My father had built an algorithm that could predict market collapses, political shifts, and corporate failures. It was the ultimate power, and he had hidden it inside the one person he believed would never use it for evil. "Simon," I said, turning back to him. The electric glow in my eyes began to fade as the surge subsided. "We have to go to the sub-basement. Aris isn't just trying to steal the data. He's trying to activate the pulse." "The pulse?" Simon asked, helping me into a pair of discarded coveralls so I wouldn't have to face the world in a paper gown. "It's a global financial reset," I explained, the weight of the knowledge pressing down on me. "If Aris triggers it, every debt, every credit record, and every bank balance in the world will be wiped clean. It sounds like a dream for the poor, but it would cause a total collapse of civilization. No food, no power, no order. He wants to be the king of the ashes." We moved through the hallways of the research center. The building was in chaos. Staff were running in every direction as the screens continued to broadcast the board's dirty secrets. No one tried to stop us. To them, I was no longer the poor orphan or even the rightful heiress. I was something terrifying and divine. We reached the service elevator that led to the sub-basement. As we descended, the air grew colder, smelling of damp earth and ancient machinery. This part of the building predated the steel and glass above. It was a remnant of my grandfather's era. The elevator doors opened to reveal a cavernous room filled with humming servers and glowing vats of blue liquid. In the center stood Dr. Kerr. His back to us, he was typing furiously on a holographic keyboard, his scarred face illuminated by the flickering light. "You're late, Elena," he said without turning around. "I've already initiated the sequence. In 10 minutes, the Vanguard Archive will become the Vanguard Apocalypse." "Why, Aris?" I asked, walking toward him. "My father trusted you. He thought you were a man of science, not a terrorist." Aris turned, a twisted smile on his lips. "Your father was a hypocrite. He sat on this mountain of truth and did nothing with it. He watched the world suffer while he kept his secret safe in his precious daughter. He was a hoarder, Elena. I am a liberator." "You're a murderer," I countered. "Millions will die in the chaos of a total collapse. A few billion lives for a clean slate. A fair trade," Aris said, his eyes gleaming with madness. He held up a small, handheld detonator. "This is the physical trigger for the server's core. Even if you use your biological key to try and lock me out, I can simply blow the heart out of the system. The data will bleed out into the world regardless." I looked at the servers, then at Aris. I realized that my father's insurance policy had one final flaw. He had assumed that the archive would always be something to be protected. He never considered that the only way to save the world might be to destroy the secret forever. "You think the data is the power," I said, stepping closer to him, ignoring Simon's warning hand on my shoulder. "But you're wrong. The power was never in the secrets. It was in the choice to keep them." I felt the tingle returning, but this time I didn't fight it. I leaned into it. I felt the connection between my blood and the machines. I didn't try to lock the system. I did something much more dangerous. "What are you doing?" Aris shouted, his smile vanishing as the holographic screens began to turn blood red. "The sequence! It's reversing. You're deleting it." "No, you can't. It's the work of a lifetime." "It's a burden I'm done carrying," I said. I channeled every ounce of the stress-love response Simon had described. I thought of my father's love, of Simon's loyalty, and even of the bitter lessons I had learned from the Black Woods. I used that emotional surge to overload the biological link. The servers began to moan, the blue liquid in the vats turning to steam. Aris lunged at me, but Simon tackled him to the ground. "Delete it all, Elena," Simon yelled. The room began to shake. The cascading numbers on the screens turned to zeros. I felt a sharp pain in my chest, a feeling of something being ripped out of my very DNA. It was agonizing, a soul-deep erasure. I fell to my knees, my vision blurring. And then there was silence. The humming of the servers died. The lights dimmed. The air grew still. Aris let out a long, howling cry of despair as he looked at the empty screens. The archive was gone. The biological sequence in my blood had been neutralized, rendered into harmless, non-coding strings once more. I was just Elena again. No secrets, no billions in hidden data. Just a woman standing in a dark room. But as I looked at Aris, who was now weeping on the floor, I saw a shadow moving in the corner of the room. It was Victor Thorne. He had escaped the police transport, or perhaps he had never been in it. He held a silenced pistol, and it was aimed directly at my heart. "If I can't have the archive," he hissed, "then no one will have the heiress." The click of the safety being disengaged echoed like a thunderclap in the sudden silence of the server room. Victor Thorne stood in the shadows, his face a mask of aristocratic fury. He looked disheveled, his expensive charcoal suit torn and stained with the grime of his escape. But the hand holding the pistol was steady. He had lost his fortune, his reputation, and his chance at the archive. Now, all that remained for him was the bitter satisfaction of an ending. "You've ruined everything, Elena," Victor whispered, the muzzle of the gun glinting in the dim emergency light. 10 years of planning, 10 years of waiting for you to grow up, for you to lead me to the prize. And you just deleted it. You threw away the greatest power in human history because of some misplaced sense of morality. "It wasn't power, Victor," I said, standing my ground despite the trembling in my knees. The agonizing heat in my blood had faded, replaced by a profound, hollow exhaustion. It was a leash. As long as that data existed, the world was tied to my father's ghost. Now everyone has to stand on their own, including you. "I don't intend to stand," Victor snarled. "I intend to leave, but I'm not leaving witnesses." Beside me, Simon moved with a speed that defied his age. He didn't go for his weapon. He stepped directly in front of me, his broad shoulders shielding my body from Victor's line of fire. "Run, Elena," he commanded, his voice low and urgent. "Move aside, Simon," Victor warned. "I have no quarrel with a loyal dog, but I will put you down if you stay in my way." "Then start shooting," Simon replied, his eyes locked on Victor. "Because the only way you're getting to her is through me." For a heartbeat, time seemed to stretch. I saw Victor's finger tighten on the trigger. I saw the madness in his eyes. The desperation of a man who had lived his whole life for a prize that had just turned to smoke. But before he could fire, the entire room shuddered. A massive explosion from the floor above sent a cascade of dust and debris raining down from the ceiling. The sub-basement wasn't just a lab, it was part of the building's structural foundation. When I had overloaded the servers, I hadn't just deleted data. I had caused a catastrophic thermal runaway in the cooling vats. The pressure had nowhere to go but up. The floor beneath Victor's feet buckled. He stumbled, the pistol firing a wild shot that hissed past Simon's ear and shattered a glowing vat of blue coolant. The liquid sprayed out in a freezing mist, obscuring the room. "The building is coming down!" Simon shouted, grabbing my hand. "We have to get to the service stairs." I looked back through the mist. Victor was scrambling to his feet, coughing as the coolant froze the air in his lungs. Further back, Dr. Aris sat motionless among his dead machines, staring at the empty screens with the vacant eyes of a man whose soul had been erased along with his work. He didn't even try to move. He had lived for the archive, and he would die with it. We scrambled toward the emergency exit, our boots splashing through the rising tide of coolant and water from the burst pipes. The sound of groaning steel filled the air, the sound of a skyscraper beginning to die. We reached the stairs and began the grueling climb. My lungs burned, and every step felt like I was lifting lead weights. The biological purge had left me physically shattered. "Almost there, Elena," Simon urged, his arm around my waist, practically carrying me up the final flight. We burst through the ground floor service doors and into the lobby. The scene was apocalyptic. The glass walls of the Vanguard building had shattered, and the street outside was a sea of blue and red lights. Fire trucks, police cars, and ambulances were everywhere. The elite who had attended the gala hours ago were now gathered across the street, huddled in blankets, watching the symbol of their world crumble. As we stumbled out onto the sidewalk, a group of paramedics rushed toward us. But before they could reach me, a familiar figure stepped out of the crowd. It was Mark. He had been released from custody, likely because the police were too overwhelmed by the chaos at the estate and the building collapse to process a minor financial fraud suspect immediately. He looked pathetic, his tuxedo jacket gone, his white shirt stained with sweat. But when he saw me, his face twisted into a look of pure, unadulterated greed. "Elena!" he shouted, pushing past a police officer. "Elena, you're alive, thank God!" He tried to grab me, his hands shaking. "Listen, I saw what happened on the screens. I saw the power you had. It's okay that the building is falling. We still have the name, right? We can rebuild. I'll tell the police I was helping you. I'll say I was a double agent. We can get the money back." I looked at him, and for the first time in my life, I felt absolutely nothing. Not anger, not pity, not even the ghost of the love I once thought was real. He was a vulture, picking at the carcass of a dream that was already dead. "There is no money, Mark," I said, my voice cold and clear, carrying to the reporters who were now swarming around us. "There is no archive. There is no Vanguard. It's all gone." But you're a billionaire," Mark stammered, his eyes darting around at the cameras. "You have to have something left. You can't just leave me with nothing." "I'm leaving you with exactly what you gave me," I said, "the truth of who you are." I turned to the nearest police officer. "Officer, this man is Mark Blackwood. He is a primary suspect in the embezzlement of the Blackwood Foundation and was an accomplice to Victor Thorne's attempted kidnapping tonight. I suggest you take him back into custody." Mark's jaw dropped. "Elena? You're turning me in? After everything?" "After everything," I agreed. As the officers moved in to take Mark away, his screams of, "I'm a Blackwood," fading into the night, I felt a hand on my shoulder. It was Beatrice. She had somehow escaped the initial transport, or had been brought back to the scene for questioning. She looked ancient, the emerald necklace, replaced by a cheap plastic ID tag from the police station. "You think you've won, don't you?" she hissed, her voice a low, venomous whisper. "You destroyed a dynasty tonight. You took a noble name and dragged it through the mud. You're a monster, Elena. A common, low-class monster." I leaned in close to her, so close she could see the flecks of gold still lingering in my eyes from the archive's light. "I didn't destroy your dynasty, Beatrice. You did. You built it on a foundation of lies and cruelty. I just turned on the lights so everyone could see the rot. And as for being a monster, at least I'm a monster who knows how to be human." Beatrice recoiled, as if I had slapped her. I turned my back on her and walked toward the ambulance, where Simon was being treated for his injuries. The sun was beginning to rise over the city, the first light of dawn hitting the smoke rising from the Vanguard building. It was the end of an era. The secrets were gone. The wealth was in probate. The family that had tried to consume me was in ruins. I sat on the back of the ambulance, a gray blanket wrapped around my shoulders. Simon sat next to me, a bandage on his head but a small, tired smile on his lips. "What now, Elena?" he asked. "You've officially given away a fortune. You have no home, no husband, and about $50 in your poor girl bank account." I looked at the sunrise, the orange and pink light reflecting off the broken glass of the street. For the first time in 3 years, maybe for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like a pawn. I didn't feel like an heiress. I didn't feel like an archive. "Now," I said, "I think I'll go get some coffee, and then I am going to start a life that belongs to me." But as I stood up, a small black sedan pulled up to the curb. The window rolled down, and a woman I had never seen before, dressed in a sharp military uniform, looked at me with an expression of intense interest. "Ms. Vanguard," she said, "my name is Director Vance from the Department of National Intelligence. We've been watching the broadcast from your building tonight. We'd like to have a conversation about what you didn't delete." The arrival of Director Vance felt like a final cold gust of wind after a storm. I looked at the black sedan, the government plates, and the woman whose eyes held the weight of 1,000 classified files. She wasn't a corporate shark like Victor, or a mad scientist like Aris. She was the system itself, and the system never likes it when a source of power simply vanishes. "I deleted everything, Director," I said, my voice steady despite the exhaustion rattling my bones. "The servers are slag. The biological sequence in my DNA has been neutralized. There is nothing left for you to collect." Director Vance stepped out of the car, her movements precise. She stood before me, unbothered by the smoke and the chaos of the collapsing building behind us. "Information that large doesn't just disappear, Ms. Vanguard. Energy can be transformed, but it rarely vanishes. You might have wiped the servers, but you are the daughter of Julian Vanguard. He didn't just teach you how to hide data. He taught you how to think. That is what we are interested in. I'm done being an asset," I replied, pulling the blanket tighter around my shoulders. "For 3 years I lived as a woman with nothing, and tonight I realized that nothing was the only time I was actually safe. If you want a strategist, look elsewhere. If you want a weapon, I'm retired." Vance looked at me for a long time, a flicker of respect, or perhaps just recognition, crossing her face. "The world is going to be very loud for you for a while, Elena. The Blackwoods are heading to prison. Victor Thorne's body was just recovered from the sub-basement, and the Vanguard board is being dismantled by federal agents as we speak. You have no money, but you have the most valuable thing in this city. A clean slate. Don't waste it. Waste." She handed me a small, plain business card. "If you ever find that you've kept a few secrets in the back of your mind, secrets that could help this country, give me a call. Until then, try to enjoy the silence." She got back into the sedan and drove away, leaving me standing on the sidewalk as the city fully woke up. Simon stood up from the ambulance, joining me. We watched the black car disappear into the morning traffic. "Is it really over?" Simon asked. "The war is over," I said. "The rest is just life." In the weeks that followed, the scandal dominated every headline. The billionaire pauper became a global sensation. People were fascinated by the story of the woman who had hidden her identity to test her husband's love, only to uncover a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of government. Mark and Beatrice became the poster children for greed and comeuppance. During the trial, Beatrice tried to plead insanity, claiming the stress of poverty had broken her mind, but the jury wasn't buying it. She was sentenced to 15 years for racketeering and fraud. Mark fared even worse. Without his mother's protection or his family's money, he folded instantly. He turned state's witness against the remaining members of the Vanguard board in a desperate attempt to reduce his sentence. But it didn't matter. He had lost the only thing he ever truly cared about, his status. The last I heard, he was working in the prison laundry, a fitting irony for a man who used to complain if his silk shirts weren't pressed to perfection. As for me, I didn't go back to the shipping empire. I didn't claim the remnants of the Vanguard fortune. I allowed the company to be liquidated, the assets sold off to pay back the victims of my father's and Victor's schemes. I kept only one thing, the small, modest apartment where I had spent my 3 years of poverty. It turned out I didn't need $1 billion to be happy. I needed the truth. 1 year later, I was sitting in a small cafe on the corner of my street, sketching the bustling morning crowd in my notebook. The silver ring Mark had given me was long gone, replaced by a simple band of gold I had bought for myself with my first paycheck from my new job as an independent architectural consultant. I wasn't rich, but I was comfortable. I wasn't famous, but I was respected. The bell above the door chimed and Simon walked in. He looked younger now, the weight of my father's secrets finally lifted from his shoulders. He sat down across from me, placing a fresh cup of coffee on the table. "You look peaceful, Elena," he noted. "I am," I said, closing my sketchbook. "I spent so much time pretending to be someone else, first the rich heiress, then the poor orphan, that I forgot who I actually was. It's nice to just be Elena." "The director still calls every few months," Simon mentioned, his eyes twinkling with amusement. "She thinks you still have the archive's prediction algorithm memorized." I laughed, a sound of genuine warmth. "Maybe I do. Or maybe I just know how to read people better than a computer ever could. My father thought he was protecting me by turning me into a vault, but the real protection was the lesson he accidentally taught me. That money can buy a palace, but only character can build a home." We sat in silence for a moment, watching the world go by. I thought about the night of the gala, the glitter, the cruelty, and the moment I stood on that stage and took my power back. I realized then that my deception hadn't been a lie. It had been a journey to find the truth. I had searched for love and found betrayal, but in that betrayal I had found my own strength. The Blackwoods had tried to make me feel small, so they could feel big. In the end, they were the ones who vanished into the shadows of history, while I walked out into the light. I had pretended to be poor, and in doing so, I had discovered a wealth that no bank could ever hold. The journey was long, and the cost was high, but as I looked at my reflection in the cafe window, a woman with a clear gaze and a steady hand, I knew I would do it all over again. Because the only thing more dangerous than a woman with a secret is a woman who no longer needs one. Thank you for watching this incredible journey of betrayal, secrets, and ultimate justice. If you enjoyed Elena's story and want to see more powerful narratives about standing up for the truth, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Click the notification bell so you never miss a story of revenge and redemption. See you in the next video.